Hello and welcome to a presentation on Section 1206 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, or DRRA. My name is Jennifer Tylander and I'm with FEMA's Floodplain Management Division, and I'm joined by my colleague Sarah Mulligan with FEMA's Public Assistance Division. Together we are excited to share new information and resources available through the DRRA's Section 1206. Section 1206 authorizes FEMA to provide assistance to state and local governments for building code and floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement. Let's take a look at our agenda of what we'll cover today. Today, we'll be providing you an overview of the policy and its goals. We will describe the available resources for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to include eligible and ineligible activities and costs. We will outline the community requirements necessary to receive support, and then finally dive into the grants portal website. The slide presentation should last approximately 20 minutes, and then we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. But first, let's provide a little bit of background on DRRA's Section 1206. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act was signed into law on October 5th, 2018. These reforms acknowledge the shared responsibility for disaster response and recovery, aim to reduce the complexity of FEMA, and continue to build the nation's capacity for the next catastrophic event. The law contains 56 distinct provisions that require FEMA policy or regulation changes for full implementation, as they amend the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. Section 1206 of DRRA specifically amended sections 402 and 406 of the Stafford Act. Due to the increased severity and frequency of disasters in recent years, FEMA worked closely with Congress to improve our disaster programs. The passage of DRRA in 2018 represents the most comprehensive emergency management reform since 2006. These reforms included a larger and more reliable funding stream for pre-disaster mitigation, incentives for disaster reduction investments, and an expansion of assistance for individuals, households, and communities. The DRRA ultimately advances FEMA's strategic goals of building a culture of preparedness, readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, and reducing the complexity of FEMA. As we noted on the previous slide, Section 1206 amends Sections 402 and 406 of the Stafford Act and authorizes FEMA to provide communities with the resources needed to effectively administer and enforce state and locally adopted building codes and floodplain management ordinances. This support is for a period no longer than 180 days after the date of the major disaster declaration. And this support includes conducting building inspections, reviewing disaster-related development in the floodplain, reviewing applications for permits, and issuing permits to adequately administer and enforce adopted building codes and floodplain ordinances. Section 1206 also supports inspections for substantial damage compliance and provides new authorities for base and overtime wages for extra hires to conduct required post-disaster activities. The two main objectives of this policy are to, one, increase the speed of recovery by providing access to new resources and means of assistance to complete post-disaster activities, and two, enhance compliance by providing additional resources to execute required post-disaster activities. Communities are better able to comply with state and local building codes and floodplain management ordinances. The policy development and rollout is a joint effort between public assistance and FEMA. FEMA began drafting the policy in late 2019 and released it for public comment in February 2020. The final policy was released in late October with an effective date of November 1st, 2020. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Sarah Mulligan to discuss the next slides on DRRA resources for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, eligibility and community requirements, and an overview of the grants portal website.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. So my name is Sarah Mulligan, and as Jennifer said at the beginning of the slide, I work for our Public Assistance Division here at FEMA. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the specific eligibility requirements for state, tribal, territorial, and local governments seeking reimbursement for these activities. So as a quick overview of DRRA 1206, the policy, the purpose of this slide is just to provide general information on eligibility based on the disaster declaration date. The way that that DRRA was written, it applies retroactively going back to August 1st, 2017. And so the policy, the beginning of the policy will outline how FEMA is going to be handling all of the prospective disasters from the effective date of November 1st, 2020, and then the retrospective disaster. So as indicated in the policy, if a disaster declaration occurs after November 1st, 2020, which is the effective date of the policy, eligible costs will be reimbursed under the provisions of the policy. So you can take the policy if you have a disaster that is declared after that date and just apply it as normal. The policy also applies to major disaster declarations for public assistance declared on or after August 1st, 2017. So for those disasters, we are asking that applicants notify FEMA of their intent to seek reimbursement for activities covered under DRRA 1206. And in order to do so, they can send a letter to the program delivery manager or the appropriate region within 90 days of the disaster declaration or within 90 days of the recovery scoping meeting, whichever is later. All activities must be in good standing, or all communities seeking reimbursement must be in good standing with NFIP to receive assistance under DRRA 1206. Another thing that's important to underscore here is because the law amended section 406 of the Stafford Act, it only applies to major disaster declarations. So if there's an emergency disaster declaration, unfortunately, we are not authorized to provide this assistance for those disasters. So as a quick summary, if the policy's effective date is November 1st, 2020, eligible activities will include those occurring either after November 1st, 2020, or for major disaster declarations that occurred between August 1st, 2017, and the effective date of the policy, so long as the applicant provides written notification to FEMA that they intend to seek reimbursement. Activities that occurred prior to August 1st, 2017 are unfortunately not eligible for reimbursement. So what we would like to do here is provide a high-level overview of the types of work that is supported under DRRA 1206. So now that you have an idea of the eligibility criteria for timing, we're going to talk about the 4 different buckets of work that we'll be funding. So this will go to building code administration, code enforcement, floodplain management regulation administration enforcement, and substantial damage determinations. In the first bucket, the type of work may include reviewing and processing applications for building permits, processing requests for building code variances, or collecting associated fees. Building code administration work may also cover costs to provide training to the public, monitoring of impacted areas or unpermitted construction activities, contracting for services, hiring and training staff to conduct such activities. The second bucket covers code enforcement activities related to development, and that would include identifying corrective actions in non-compliant situations, reviewing elevation certificates, investigating complaints of violations. The third bucket covers floodplain management, regulation, administration, and enforcement related activities. Regulation activities could include training and outreach to the public, reviewing development proposals, processing permits for disaster-related development. Other activities may include things like inspecting disaster-related development and processing variance requests, or conducting inspections, hiring staff, and contracting for services to conduct eligible activities covered under this category. The third and final bucket are activities supporting substantial damage operations. So these activities might include conducting initial field surveys and preparing cost information. Substantial damage operations may include tracking cumulative substantial damage and repetitive loss for communities, conducting damage inventories, and hiring and training of staff. So again, DRRA 1206 authorizes FEMA to provide state, local governments with the resources to more effectively manage their building code administration, enforcement, floodplain management regulation, and substantial damage operations post-disaster. So now that we've covered the criteria around timing and the types of eligible work, we wanted to provide some detail on the remaining eligibility criteria for work under 1206. So one thing to note that the way that the policy was written provides a very detailed but not exhaustive list of eligible activities. So it's entirely possible that an eligible activity is not detailed in the policy, and the intent of the policy was to describe the parameters for eligibility. But generally, what we'll be doing is finding anything that is consistent with the work that is normally done by a community to administer and enforce their building codes or floodplain management regulations and ordinances, should be eligible under this, this provision. All building code and floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement activities must relate to the repair, replacement, retrofit of disaster damaged buildings. And so unlike a lot of other assistance that public assistance provides under section 406, this can relate to both public, private, commercial, residential properties. So anything that a normal building department would provide this service for in blue skies scenarios would be eligible for public assistance for the purposes of code enforcement and administration. Activities that are not eligible are anything associated with non-disaster damage development. So if there is a permit application that comes to a local building department for like a kitchen remodel, that would not be eligible under this assistance. We're just keeping it to disaster-related development and recovery work. Also not eligible are activities to update communities, laws, rules, or procedures or requirements, like updating a building code or adopting new zoning requirements. And the reason for that is because of the way that our authorities are written under section 406 of the Stafford Act. Everything has to be a result of the disaster. And so outdated building codes or outdated zoning requirements aren't necessarily a result of the disaster. So therefore, they are generally ineligible for this assistance. Now that we talked about eligible work, we're going to dive into a little bit about eligible costs. So eligible costs under section 1206 are reimbursed at the cost share for permanent work. And this includes extra funding for overtime wages for budgeted employees. Straight time for budgeted employees is not eligible. That's covered under the general operating budget of a community. So anything that they have to pay overtime to respond to the disaster would be eligible for reimbursement. And straight time and overtime for extra hires. So if there is an emergency management agreement that states might have with one another, those costs would be covered. If it's costs associated with contracted work or temporary extra hires, that would generally be covered under this policy. Additionally, the purchase of supplies and equipment necessary to effectuate the eligible work is also covered here. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer to talk a little bit about FEMA's Risk Management Division and their contracting support.
Thank you, Sarah. Sure. Over the past 15 to 20 years, FEMA has provided direct assistance to communities through the substantial damage data collection contract support. And these efforts were funded at 100% by FEMA. With the issuance of the 1206 policy, there will be some changes when this type of direct contract support is available and in funding cost share requirements. FEMA's substantial damage data collection contract support is available to support SLTTs with eligible activities as described in the policy. However, the policy limits its availability to cases where the state, tribal, territorial, and local government lack the capability to perform or contract for eligible substantial damage data collection related efforts due to the extreme catastrophic nature of an event or a demonstrated lack of resources. The policy is primarily focused on PA grant reimbursement and for eligible activities performed by SLTTs and their contractors. For both PA reimbursement and the direct substantial damage data collection contract support, assistance provided will be subject to the permanent work cost share applicable to the disaster. This cost share is usually, but not always, 75% federal, with the remaining 25% to be provided by the state, local, tribal, or territorial entity. Local governments that seek assistance through FEMA's substantial damage data collection contract must submit a request in writing to the state, which will review and, if warranted, submit the request to the FEMA regional administrator. Similarly, states seeking assistance will submit the request to the FEMA regional administrator as well. Requests must include specific information as detailed in the policy. For instance, the reason why a contract is needed versus SLTTs performing the work themselves, the agreement to meet the funding match, etc. So that concludes the description of the Risk Management Division Substantial Damage Data Collection Contract. Thanks, Sarah. Turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. So going into a little bit about communities' requirements, communities wishing to seek reimbursement for activities covered under this policy must submit their applications for reimbursement and all supporting documentation through the PA Grants Manager portal. PA provides technical assistance to communities that are unfamiliar with this grants portal when a disaster is declared. There are also various trainings online that can be taken. To receive funding, applicants must submit the following documentation to FEMA. So that will be all supporting documentation necessary to demonstrate that the work was completed, or an estimated task and cost for the work to be completed. And that would include a lot of other demonstration of compliance with things like procurement that have to follow requirements as outlined in public assistance policy, as well as Code of Federal Regulations for all federal grants. All documentation associated with work completed through something like an Emergency Management Assistance Compact, an EMAC, resource requests or interstate mutual aid agreements. This could also include a cost breakdown of the total costs, applicants' accounting of expenditures, procurement documents, or any demonstration that allows, or any documentation that allows FEMA to validate that the work was performed. So you need to demonstrate that the work was completed, demonstrate or provide information on the location of the work, and then validate that the resource request or mutual aid agreements, exactly what went into those agreements and how they were executed. And again, the community requirements these are all community requirements in order to receive support under DRRA 1206. So the next thing we have are just a couple of screenshots to show folks what to expect when you sign into the grants portal. For anyone who is familiar with FEMA or has had disasters in the past that have fallen under grants portal, we have a new software that we're using as an interface between FEMA and our communities, and it offers a lot more functionality than our previous systems have provided us. So when you sign into grants portal, you'll have an account specific to your community. And so you can see here this is what the sign-in sheet will look like. Again, anyone who has trouble accessing the system, there's plenty of resources, both online and personal resources that can assist. All right, moving on here. For past disasters, we are continuously making updates to the grants portal. And so when you sign in for the first time as either a new applicant or a returning applicant for a different disaster, you'll get a list right here of all the different changes that have been made to the grant portal and an explanation of that functionality and why it was made right here. So you can refer back to if it looks a little different or if there are new things to fill out, you can always refer back to this slide to show you what the major changes have been. And excellent. And then every applicant has an applicant event profile. And so that'll just to kind of have the nuts and bolts of the disaster, all the relevant information. And from here, you'll be able to navigate towards the process of actually filling out getting initial documentation submitted, scopes of work, and kind of starting to build the process here. And so it's very much a collaboration between FEMA and the applicants. And everything is in here. And so applicants will get notifications when when different parts of the grant application move through the system. And there's hopefully a lot of visibility, and it'll make sure that applicants are kind of aware of the movements of their grant and their grant funding along the way. Okay, so we want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. We understand that DRRA 1206 establishes a new way of providing support to state and local governments to increase the overall speed of recovery and support compliance, and ultimately promote a more resilient and safe community. We will likely have questions about how this will impact your disasters operations. So we encourage anyone to submit questions to us or contact your regional office or state office for additional information. For more information that we put out, it will be on FEMA.gov to review the policy and associated materials and to provide contact information for reaching out to, say, State Floodplain Management Insurance Branch or State NFIP Coordinator's Office. So everyone, thank you for the time.